As an outsider, it's hard to see the ways young athletes are involved in climate action. But this volleyball coach says climate awareness is ingrained in the habits of today's generation.
Did anybody say woke as many times as I did, or am I the young guy that was the only person that said it?
In this episode, we have UBC men's volleyball coach Michael Hawkins, who speaks to us about how COVID has impacted sports and how it's shaping the future of sports. Hi, Mike. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me.
So why don't you start by telling us a little bit about yourself, what you do, and what kind of sustainable practices you engage in as a coach?
Yeah, so my name's Michael Hawkins. I'm the head coach of the UBC men's volleyball team. And I guess kind of in preparing for this podcast, for this interview, it was a really unique kind of personal exercise just to reflect on what forms of sustainability that I practice in. And in a funny way, like similar to my role with the men's volleyball team. So I'm the head coach, but I kind of do a little bit of everything. So I'm kind of primarily in charge of recruiting, but then there's also fundraising and alumni engagement, marketing. I kind of dabble in a little bit of everything. And I would say that the answer is kind of the same when it comes to sustainability. We kind of like in an overarching sense are kind of involved with human sustainability, just in terms of being able to bring in student athletes and develop them obviously as student athletes, like as people on the volleyball court or whatever field of play, but also given the fact that they're post-secondary students, being involved in their kind of growth academically and personally. And then kind of woven into that is going to be the social aspect, dealing with cohesion amongst our team and creating our own social environment. And then obviously, particularly given the current state of the world and kind of the economic current state of the world, we are always kind of navigating like those fields as well, like understanding economic sustainability within our own program, and kind of what I alluded to previously around fundraising. Like that's a form of economic sustainability that we practice kind of on the daily, or we try to continue building within our program, while all kind of under the lens of like what that means with environmental sustainability. And in a funny way, preparing for this podcast has actually opened my mind to things that maybe we're already doing, or in a funny way, and I'm sure I'm going to say this 40 more times in this podcast, is I think COVID has just forced us to question our like status quo, our processes, our systems, and we haven't been immune to that. Obviously as a department, but like with our team in particular. And I think in a funny way, that's going to put us in a much better spot coming out of, the COVID pandemic.
Yeah. And so speaking of the COVID pandemic, like how has the volleyball season changed? And, how have you and your team been impacted by everything that's going on? And how do you think that's also impacted the way, your team altogether approach sustainability?
Yeah, it's hard to find a way that it hasn't changed during COVID. So like a typical season, we kind of have, 3 different phases. So September to, middle of October, we're in preseason. We travel to different exhibition tournaments. We run some fundraisers, some high school tournaments, stuff like that. And then really like that major chunk of our season goes from October all the way till March. So that's kind of our Canada West competition. We travel, we play teams kind of locally, like the Trinity Westerns, UFVs, and some of the other BC teams. But Canada West goes all the way out to Winnipeg, all the way out in Manitoba. So when it comes to our regular Canada West schedule, like we're flying really across like 2/3 of our country to play games, and like that's just kind of a normal thing. Like we, every other week essentially we're traveling to those faraway places in Canada. So COVID has obviously negatively affected that in the sense that we haven't had a competitive season. We, for the most part, we've actually been pretty fortunate here in BC that we've been able to train like relatively uninterrupted. in the sense that we didn't have, significant lockdowns like some of the other provinces. But even then, COVID has kind of restricted exactly what we've been able to do, particularly around like building the social aspect around our team. And it was something that I don't think I necessarily realized until a couple months into the season, where, we kind of had this like fly in, fly out feel to practice, where because of, our COVID regulations and protocols, we just couldn't, have like formal team meetings. The guys couldn't socialize how they normally would. So, in a funny way, and again, referring to what I already said, like we've just had to reflect on, what we were doing before. Was that the most efficient way to go about, executing our objectives? So if our objectives are, building like a cohesive social environment, okay, if we can't do that on road trips or on, these, bigger events, like we've been fortunate, we've gone on some international exchanges. If we can't do that, like how are we still going to build that social environment with our team? And then obviously not being able to compete, how do we still kind of develop these student athletes as, competitors and athletes on the court?
So, as challenging as things might be in this online world, what have you been doing? What are your approaches to make sure that these athletes are engaged as a team and collaborate to prepare them for when things gets back to normal?
Yeah, we've, I'd say like kind of like everybody, we've just been looking at different ways to kind of achieve our objectives. So as much as the guys kind of rolled their eyes about it, in the summer and even in the fall, like we hopped on Zoom calls every once in a while. And sometimes they're, like painful. Sometimes I'm having to, single guys out to, share some information or share what they've been up to. But, that was kind of our only option. And then even this year, because we can't technically have team meetings, sometimes we're gonna have to hop on a Zoom call with Ian Perry, our mental performance coach. And Ian's been doing, kind of like one-on-one interviews or one-on-one sessions with the guys. He's just had to do it over Zoom. So, technology has really allowed us to still kind of move forward with some of those, those objectives. But yeah, we've had to be creative, and I don't know if there's necessarily a perfect way that we've found yet, but fingers crossed we can return to some level of more normalcy or status quo in the future.
Just out of my curiosity, and maybe for some of our audiences who are not familiar with college sports, could you tell us a little bit about these mental performance sessions?
Yeah, so we're really fortunate. So each year is just as important as like our athlete development and like our physical skill development, because this year has just posed such unique challenges and obstacles for our student athletes. So Ian, he'll meet with the guys one-on-one, and we kind of do it on like a rotating calendar. So once a week, Ian will kind of have his day where he'll meet with 4 or 5 athletes. But then we also have, Ian plus Whitney Sedgwick, who's she's a resource that kind of comes from the department. She works here at UBC in counseling services, but she has a really impressive athletics background. So then she'll do some more like team sessions. So this year, because we're not competing, we're not going to have the, how do we handle pressure in competition, type of mental performance sessions, but it's gonna be a lot more around, even what we were talking about earlier with the social sustainability, that, creating that lasting legacy of team culture and identifying what values are most important to this group, but also important for the program as a whole. And how can we use this year, we're not chalking up wins and losses and, winning any trophies, but, how can we still build a legacy that's going to last, for future years?
I recognize that, COVID and environmentalism will continue to affect your decision as a coach, and for many major league, sports team managers down the line. So I don't know, Mike, what do you expect the role of sustainability to be within sports and athletics? And maybe tell us a little bit about, what do you hope to see as well?
Yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting. And in a really funny timing, I had actually listened to a sport podcast this morning, and kind of unexpectedly, they came onto this topic. And the idea was just like, how is sports broadcasted? Like, how is that going to change? How are sport interviews going to change? And even for us, like, recruiting is something that typically, like, we'll travel a lot to go to these tournaments. And, you know, when we're talking about these large scale events like the Olympics, I think what's just going to happen is, you know, COVID has forced us to sit back and identify, like, what is it that we're doing? What have we just done because we're just historically, you know, rolling over what's been done before? And then how can we just do it better? And I think that there is this wave of ensuring that, you know, economic decisions aren't the ones that are, you know, completely leading the charge. Like, that's not like the main factor in the decision-making process. And I think events like the Olympics, like the, you know, FIFA World Cup or other, you know, really major sporting events are starting to understand the environmental impacts and social impacts that their events have. You know, even thinking back to when Brazil hosted the World Cup, whatever, a handful of years ago, I kind of feel like that was the last one where I think they kind of had this, you know, PR, hey, you know, this is going to be a really economically and environmentally sustainable World Cup. And it became very obvious very quickly that that wasn't the case. And I think because that was just such a shocking example of how a major sporting event kind of left a country and a people decimated, that now moving forward, a lot of the decisions on who's going to host these events are kind of based on how is it going to be the most sustainable. So very selfishly, I read that Vancouver is kind of being considered as a host. I can't remember what year it is, but I think they're looking at hosting the Winter Olympics again, because the IOC, they're just like, hey, Vancouver already has all the facilities. We don't need to spend hundreds of billions of dollars. We don't need to disrupt, you know, ecosystems to build these gigantic facilities. Let's just continue running with what we already have. And I think, you know, Japan, like Tokyo, this summer is going to be really interesting in terms of, are they going to have fans? I truthfully do think that they're going to happen. I think financially there's a lot of implications with not having an Olympics. But selfishly, as someone involved in sport, I think it would just be really difficult for those athletes and coaches and, you know, training staff that have prepared for the Olympics to just have it removed. But I do think that they're going to really look at, you know, kind of the toll that it'll take to run this as effectively as possible.
Yeah, and Mike, right now we're seeing a lot of celebrity athletes, you know, taking on voices around Black Lives Matter and gender equality. Do you believe, you know, athletes are the right people to encourage these decisions and choices that leads us to a more sustainable lifestyle?
Yeah, I think it's tough to, like, pinpoint athletes as being, you know, kind of like the sole people that are aware or, you know, practice sustainability. But again, kind of similar to the previous question, I just think that young people are just more conscious and more aware. And I think, you know, it's kind of to what you touched on. I think, you know, particularly with our guys, and I can speak to kind of like our current Thunderbirds athletes, I really do think that they relish the opportunity to be role models within our community in a bunch of different things. Like, we're pretty outspoken when it comes to, you know, kind of the social equality movement and even just conversations that come up around social injustice. And I think particularly with COVID and making socially responsible decisions, like, I think our athletes and really like our program and department, we take pride in being role models within our community.
I kind of going back to one of the previous questions, have you or your team or like the Thunderbirds in general ever made specific decisions like in everyday conversation that kind of reflect that people are thinking about sustainability? So like that could be from like your equipment that you're using, the materials of like your uniforms or jerseys, or
like sustainability, environmental sustainability is going to have effect on some of those things around like equipment and transportation. But again, I think what I do appreciate is that it's not completely removed from the conversation. Like I wouldn't say that it completely directs us, you know, down a certain path, but again, like being a part of this UBC community, I just think it's always a part of the conversation. And I think that we're fortunate that it's at least present at the table. You know what I mean? And that other priorities aren't, kind of taking the spotlight. So, especially when it comes to transportation, I think that's going to be a big one, particularly like moving forward, is just like, how can we operate sustainably? Like when we're traveling to exhibition tournaments, or if we're hosting events, or even actually, I think the big one, and I don't know if I've kind of touched on this enough, is just like how we operate within our facilities. Again, because UBC is a pretty massive machine, like we have significant facilities, and facilities can oftentimes be kind of like the quiet killer when it comes to like environmental sustainability. But in a funny way, that's been one really positive outcome to COVID, is that like our facility isn't just open all the time. Like the lights aren't on all the time. Every office isn't filled all the time. And I just think that that's going to be the trend moving forward as we navigate the post-COVID world. And I think obviously it's going to have economic implications. Just using less energy is going to cost less money. But I think it's just going to bring a heightened awareness to like what those environmental implications are going to be. And then I think once those get highlighted more, then kind of like coming back to the actual question you asked, then I think that it's just going to be more prevalent when we're making these decisions. It's like, okay, some of these changes that we've made, here are the benefits in terms of environmental sustainability, and here's how more decisions like this can continue affecting our sustainability. Because again, I think it's just like the education and awareness piece. Like, I think you just need to have that aha moment. And I think we've kind of been forced into that aha moment. So I'm hopeful that it's going to continue kind of being that way moving forward. I don't know if that answered your question whatsoever, but it brought up the thought of facilities, especially while I'm in my office only using like a little lamp as opposed to these horrendous fluorescent lights. But it's just kind of like a common, just like office space. It's going to be a big deal how office space is used. And, we're very much a part of that, especially when we have, 4 different court sports teams using this same facility. It's like when we're not in here, we all shut off the lights and we close the building down. And I can tell you before, I never knew how to shut off the lights before this year. I was just like, oh, someone with facilities will figure it out. Chances are it was probably left on overnight because, a lot of times after games, we would be the last ones in here. But now I'm just completely aware of it because I almost feel like a responsibility to ensure that we're kind of closing things down appropriately.
Wow, I didn't know that. It wasn't a common practice before this year. That's very
no, because like there was just someone else's job. Yeah. and again, like I just wouldn't even recognize, if I'm the last person in the building, I should probably make sure that everything is closed down. Because I'm like, oh, there's some, facilities operations worker or facilities manager that's taking care of it. And it's just kind of like out of sight, out of mind. But again, like I just think now everything is in sight and in mind in like a really kind of funny, like roundabout way.
It's so simple to know that, you should switch off the light when you're the last one to leave the room. But like you said, when there's somebody else traditionally taking care of this, it becomes less obvious for anyone else to do the job.
Well, and that just, it really adds up. If we're saying that, I'll try to be kind or try to estimate this on the low end, but if I think of the times last year, like in a pre-COVID year, the amount of times that we would have a game on Friday and I would stay with our coaching staff and we'd be hopefully discussing more wins than losses, but we'll more often than not be the last ones to leave this building. That's probably going to happen like 6 to 8 times on the year. Again, I didn't know how to shut off the lights like prior to this year because I was just like, oh yeah, someone else would deal with it. So it's like that's 6 or 8 Friday nights where the gym lights were likely kept on from, when we all got here at 4 p.m. when, before the women's match until the next morning when the first team comes in for their game day practice. That's a lot of time for a ton of lights in a really big facility to be left on. So again, it seems really simple. It seems really trivial. But if men's volleyball does that 6 to 8 times, there's a good chance that the basketball teams will also do the same. And there's a good chance that, some of the, admin staff that work here, if they're the last ones in the office, it's easy to shut off your own office light. But if you notice that, the gym lights are still on, or, et cetera, it just wasn't on the forefront of, what we were thinking about as we were walking out. But now, again, I think because the pandemic has kind of forced us to navigate tasks and responsibilities because of the, financial implications that has. Now we're just made aware of more things. So again, there's kind of been this roundabout environmental understanding of how our actions can have environmental effects.
So Mike, what does the ideal sustainable world look like to you?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think in a funny way, it's kind of continuing on this trajectory that we're currently on. So again, we already referred to the fact that environmental sustainability and economic sustainability do not need to be dichotomous. They do not need to be on two opposite ends of the spectrum. And I think because there's enough of an awareness and education is starting to become more prevalent around environmental sustainability, that, if we're looking at those two pillars of sustainability, I think we're trending in a good direction. I think that there still needs to be a gentle push from, the higher ups, the decision makers with, organizations, but also government and politics. I think that needs to continue to kind of be on the forefront. But I do think that we're trending in the right direction, particularly here on the West Coast, particularly here in BC, because I do think that it's a greater priority. But then when you also take into consideration the human and social aspects of sustainability, I think that's another area where people are just questioning the status quo. And I think cancel culture has definitely some negative aspects to it, but I think once you kind of strip down maybe some of the emotion out of cancel culture, and you're just evaluating is how we're currently living the most efficient and appropriate way, yes or no? If the answer is no, then seek out those solutions. And I think the younger generations just do that naturally. I just don't think that they accept the status quo. I don't think they're just going to nod their head and say, yes, sir, yes, ma'am, whatever was done before. I think that they're just always going to question the status quo. And I think that's such a positive characteristic that these generations have. So my idealistic, sustainable future, I would say, is hopefully one that isn't too far away. I think it's one that looks at all the pillars and doesn't look to have, you're not on one end of the spectrum or the other. It's all kind of interwoven. And I think hopefully we continue down that trajectory and down that path sooner than later.
So in that regard, would you like to give out a message or say anything to the UBC community as a whole, or Thunderbirds in general, or maybe even to your team more specifically?
I would say just continue educating yourself. And again, I kind of joked when we started this, me preparing for this conversation educated myself, where it's okay, I'm going to reflect on how I'm living my life. And it's okay, I'm doing okay. I could definitely be better. But I think, again, understanding, in a funny way, UBC is literally and figuratively a bit of a bubble in the sense that we're kind of separated, segregated from the rest of the city. But also I think our realities are going to be a little bit different than the realities of schools in Alberta, in Saskatchewan, in Ontario. But I think my message to UBC as a greater community is just continue being role models, because the eyes are going to continue being on us as a university. And I think I would just echo that down all the way through kind of the levels that you were just referring to. I think our athletic department and athletics and recreation, I think are going to continue being role models in our UBC community and Vancouver community. So I think if we continue being advocates for sustainability and using our platform and using our voice appropriately to send that message, And again, like our team being a piece of, 25 different sport teams that make up our athletics department, and then thousands of people that participate in recreation on campus, I would just urge people to continue using their voice, like continue being advocates for sustainable living. And kind of like I said, just educate yourself. So, maybe even recognizing things that you're already doing just because you are part of the woke culture, but also just like amending things where you know that you can. And obviously everyone's going to have their own constraints, just based on, kind of what their lives look like. But I think constantly moving to a more sustainable future and a sustainable way of life is just going to continue making our community even stronger.
I think it's a really important thing you've addressed right now, and even earlier, was that there's a lot of interconnectivity, a lot of like this problem is not like a one-sided thing. It's got a lot of, you mentioned economic aspects, social aspects, and environmental aspects, obviously. And this conversation was very insightful, to say the least, to understand where you as a coach come from and where you see your team, the athletes, Thunderbirds in general, or what your perspective is on the UBC community doing work on climate action. So thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us.
Thank you guys for reaching out and having me be a part of this.